Alright, it's a little hot, above 90 degrees. So I've been planning on making this video for a little while, and then just yesterday, I think, Abroad in Japan posted a video very similar to what this is going to be. So I thought I'd take advantage of his video going up and just sit down and finally record the video that I was supposed to record a few months ago. I'm getting the laptop out for this one. So maybe recently you've seen articles with headlines like this one from the New York Times. This article is a little bit older, but if you were to go on YouTube right now, you'll find plenty of YouTube videos or a series of videos talking about buying old Japanese houses for crazy cheap prices. As someone with my feet in both the American and Japanese world, I would be lying if I said I hadn't considered the possibility of buying one or more of these old houses. Because on the surface, these prices for somebody who's looking at real estate are extremely tantalizing. And not to mention, there is a bit of cool factor that goes into saying that you own real estate in Japan. But I'm here to splash some water, some cold water, and talk realistically about buying one of these abandoned homes in Japan. Before we start all this, two things. I'm going to assume that you have the means to move to Japan in the first place. You have a job lined up. You have the means to stay long term. And you have a grasp on the language. And the second thing is to smash that like button. If you continue watching and you enjoy this video, please hit that like button. It really helps out the channel. In my opinion, there are a lot of risks involved with buying one of these akiya, but there are three major ones that I'm going to talk about today. The first one is the acquisition of property. The second one is repairs. And the third one is property value. So the first one we're going to look at is the acquisition of the property. One thing that is often overlooked about akiya, that word actually, can either mean an empty or abandoned house. And there is a distinction between those two words, because an abandoned house means that there might not even be a seller, whereas an empty house, you might just have somebody wanting to rent out that building to somebody. Because here's an interesting thing about property in Japan, is that there's no requirement for transference of ownership to be recorded. What that really means and how it plays out is that it can be difficult to find who the true owner of a certain property is. It means that you're probably going to have to go digging through tax records to find out who the actual owner of the property is. But if the owner of the property is dead, it's possible that you may not be able to purchase the property at all, or you might be buying it through the town. So that's the big first risk. You might be actively looking for an akiya, and you might find the perfect one, but then trying to find out who actually owns that might be an issue. Number two, repairs. So the Abroad in Japan video that just came out, they are in a very specific part of a very specific city. So they're in Kyoto, and they're looking at these places called machiya. And they go into the problems of buying one of those. But one of the things that I appreciated about that video is that it does take the time, he does take the time to go into what really goes into repairing one of these akiya, and the price point that goes into repairing one of these things, because it's something that a lot of people might not ever think about. Because you read that headline, you know, there are 8 million abandoned homes in Japan, and they're just giving them away. They're free. But nobody really thinks about what is involved with the repairs and how much repairs cost. And I think the best way to illustrate this is with the old adage, you get what you pay for. If you're paying pennies, or even a couple $1,000s for a structure, there's a reason why you're paying a couple $1,000s for a structure. I don't even know where to start with this one, really. In my opinion, this is probably a bottleneck for most people even considering this idea. This is assuming that you're not just going to tear down the thing and start from scratch, or just try to sell the land. Normal things when buying a house, you want to look at structure, roof, and foundation. What are those things like? Is the roof sagging? Is the foundation solid? Is the structure cracked or coming apart in any way? Those three things are usually going to be where you're going to spend the most money. So that is the abandoned grandparents' house. One thing I didn't notice, you can see the corner of the house. I don't know if you can see it very well right now, but there is cracking, and obviously that's just going to get worse with more time. You can also see under the rafter here, and the same goes for this garage, that there's a pretty big hole, and it's most likely stuff is getting up in there, animals and all sorts of good stuff. Is there mold? Is there standing water anywhere? Are there any leaks anywhere in any of the plumbing? Is that plumbing in good condition, or does it even exist? You'll see throughout this video, I'm actually playing footage of an abandoned house owned by my wife's family that we visited this past year. And this is just for visual aid, but just so everyone knows, this house was built in the 70s, maybe. But the toilet is just a hole in the ground. There is no septic system. I don't know what they do with the gray water for the showers and tubs, but there is no connected septic system that catches any of this. There is one toilet, it's on the ground floor, and it's just a hole in the ground. So is that something that you want to fix, or that needs to be added? All of this is not even to mention, do you know what the Japanese building code is and how to build to that standard? So these are all just sort of practical things that a person might not think of when they see headlines like, you know, buy a home for free, or, you know, $5,000, $10,000. Going along with that thought of everything being up to Japanese standards and codes, can the house withstand a natural disaster? Is the structure safe for earthquakes? Or depending on where you're living in the country, is it going to be safe for tsunamis? The akiya is going to need repairs, possibly major ones. And if not repairs, then most likely general quality of life improvements. I did like one of the aspects that that the Abroad in Japan video brought up that I didn't even think of, but is totally true, is insulation. Depending on where you live in Japan, it can get really cold. The house, the akiya, is probably most likely not going to have any sort of central heating system. So are you going to install a heat pump or an AC unit or something like that? I mean, that's a big job, which brings us into our third big risk area, property value. Americans care a lot about the value of property, whether that's through maintenance or the neighborhood or whatever. The value of property fluctuates, but one way that you can make your house more valuable is by maintaining it, and by making upgrades to it, and making repairs to it, and making additions to it. All of these things add value to your home. If they're done right, and if they're done well, they will add value to your home. With very few exceptions, houses in Japan, especially ones built in the latter half of the past century, are essentially built to last about 30 years. It essentially means that your house, the akiya that you buy and put all of this work into, will never gain value. So why does that matter? Why do we care about this? The first big reason is that when you initially try to buy one of these homes, you may need a loan, and a bank is most likely not going to loan against an asset with no value. The second reason is if you ever wanted to sell that home. It almost doesn't matter the amount of work you do on the home unless it becomes a sort of ship of Theseus, wherein the home you initially bought is no longer the home that you're trying to sell. In that case, you probably could sell it. But then, if that's the case, why buy one of these things in the first place? Because you're probably spending, you know, according to the Abroad in Japan video, you're probably spending upwards of $250,000, $300,000, depending on where you are, and all those disclaimers. There's a reason these homes are empty, and it has to do with a very specific culture surrounding used homes in Japan. Now, that being said, I did want to give some exceptions to my thoughts here. The risks that I listed still go for everybody, but there are reasons that you would still maybe lean towards buying a used home in Japan. Number one, you have some sort of connection to Japan. Your parents, your grandparents, whatever, and maybe you want to live there by yourself, or maybe you are trying to start a family and you want to live somewhere outside of the city that's relatively cheap, that you don't mind fixing up and doing all the work on. Basically, if you're gonna start a family and you want somewhere with a yard and so kids can run around, and you want something a little bigger, a little more spacious, a little more, dare I say, American big, then I would say like that sort of lifestyle, you'd be better off looking for something big outside of a major city. Exception number two, which kind of goes hand in hand with exception number one, is that you have a lot of money and it's just your dream to do all of these things, where you live in Japan, you buy one of these houses, you fix it up, and you do all that work yourself, or you hire out some of it and you do some of it yourself, and that's sort of like your goal. You want to do that sort of thing. Okay, so now we're at the real end of the video. I know most of the people watching this video are never going to buy a house in Japan, so I'm gonna expand on a bigger lesson that I think you can take from the whole 8.5 million abandoned houses in Japan headline, is that if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If all you're reading is headlines and blurbs of this housing situation or anything, you might never know, or have never known, that it's just probably a terrible idea for most people to buy abandoned homes in Japan. But thank you to those who like the video. Thank you for commenting. If you do, please, if there is a reason why buying an abandoned house in Japan is a good idea, that I didn't talk about, please comment it below. I'm sure there are, I just haven't thought of them. Thank you to my subscribers, and thank you to those who decide to subscribe after this. There's more Japan to come. We got a few more videos in the chamber, and then after that, I don't know what the channel has in store. But stay tuned, have a great summer, and I'll see you in the next one.